Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hope you guys are having a good day. This is a video to clarify how to estimate square roots. But before we do that, let's talk about perfect squares versus square roots, right? So a perfect square is a number like 25. The reason 25 is a perfect square is because if I take a number and multiply that number times itself, I'm going to get 25. So think of a number that you multiply times itself to get 25. That number should be 5. 5 times itself, 5, gets me 25. Now, let's think of another perfect square. So if I multiply, say, 6 times itself, I get 36. So 36 is my perfect squares. The perfect squares are 25, 36. Think of another number. So let's say if I multiply 3 times itself, I'm going to get 9. So 9 is another perfect square. These are examples of perfect squares. My suggestion to you right now would be to memorize all the perfect squares you get when you multiply 1 times 1, 2 times 2, 3 times 3, all the way to 15 times 15, right? If you can memorize all those perfect squares, the next couple of weeks are going to be way easier for you. So, but now let's go the opposite direction. Let's say we're square rooting those perfect squares. So let's take 25, for example. If I square root 25, well, I'm looking for the number that I multiply times itself to get me to 25. In this case, it would be 5. But it wouldn't just be 5, because there's another number that I can multiply times itself to get me 25. If I multiply -5 times itself, I also get 25, which means the square root of 25 is 5, certainly. And most of the times, they're just going to ask you for the positive square root. But it can also be -5. Just like if I square root 36. Well, the square root of 36 is 6. But it can also be -6, because if I take -6, multiply it times itself, I'm also going to get 36. And now the square root of 9. The square root of 9 is 3, but it can also be -3, because -3 times -3 is also positive 9, since a negative times a negative equals a positive. So these are examples of perfect squares and square roots. Let's see if you can square root this on your own. What is the square root of 64? Press pause and see if you can do it. Square root of 64 is 8 or -8, because 8 times 8 gets me 64. -8 times -8 gets me 64. Let's do one more. Try the square root of 81. Press pause. Square root of 81 is 9 or -9. One more. See if you can do this one. Square root of 225. Press pause. Yeah, this one's tough. Square root of 225 is either 15 or -15. This has not been what's been confusing for most people. So for most people, what's confusing is what happens if you have a square root, but you want to estimate where that square root is, because you're trying to figure out the square root of a number that is not a perfect square, right? So let's look at numbers that are not perfect squares. Okay. So let's think of a number like 67. The square root of 67. So this one's a little tough because the square root of 67, first of all, is not a perfect square, right? There is no number that I can multiply times itself that gets me 67. There's a number that I can multiply times itself that gets me 64. So 64 is a perfect square, right? And if I square root 64, I'm going to get 8. And for the purposes of IXL, they're working with the positive square root, so I'm not going to worry about the negative. That still doesn't tell me what the square root of 67 is, although I know that 67 is higher than 64, so my square root here must be a little bit above 8. I also know that the next perfect square after 67 has to be 81. So if I square root 81, I'm going to get 9. Which means that the square root of 67 has to be somewhere between 8 and 9. So most people will go with 8.5, right? Because the number between 8 and 9 is 8.5. However, those are people who are not thinking the entire way through. Because 67 is considerably closer to 64 than it is closer to 81. So 67 is not right down the middle, so 8.5 as the square root of 67 would not be reasonable. Since 67 is closer to 64, this number here should be closer to 8. So I would go with anywhere between 8.1 and 8.2. Approximately 8.2. That would be a safe bet. Let's do one more. So let's say now we're talking about the square root of 105. Try that on your own. Press pause. So, I know this. I know that there's a number before 105 that is a perfect square. This is why I'm telling you guys to memorize all the perfect squares that you get by multiplying 1 times 1, 2 times 2, 3 times 3, all the way up to 15 times 15, right? Because I know that 10 times 10 gets me a perfect square, which would be 100. So if I square root 100, I'm going to get 10. Well, now I have to think of the perfect square that is right after 105. Well, the perfect square right after 105 would have to be 11 times 11. And 11 times 11 gets me 121. So my next perfect square is 121. And the square root of 121 is 11. Let me put this a little lower. So now I know that the square root of 105 is somewhere between 10 and 11. But 105 is closer to 100 than it is to 121. So I'm going to go with a safe bet of around 10.2. Let's do one more positive one, then we'll get to some negatives, because I had a student that really wanted to know what happens if there's a negative sign outside of the square root. Here we go. Okay, let's think of the square root of square root of 95. So I know this. There is a perfect square before 95. So I have to think of a number times itself that gets me a perfect square. And that would be 9 times 9. 9 times 9 gets me 81. So I know that 81 is a perfect square before 95. If I square root 81, I'm going to get 9. The next perfect square after 95 would be 100, because 10 times 10 is 100. Well, the square root of 100 is 10. So now I know that the square root of 95 has to be approximately between 9 and 10. In this case, 95 is closer to 100 than it is to 81. Which means, press pause and try this on your own, see what you get here. 95 is, I'm sorry, the square root of 95 is probably around 9.8. That's a safe bet, because 95 is closer to 100 than it is to 81. Okay, this is how we estimate square roots. But what happens, right, if we change this particular problem to, instead of estimating the square root of 95, what happens if I put a negative outside, like this? Once I put a negative out here, that means that my square root is going to end up being a negative number. So this is going to be some sort of negative number, right? So I'm still going to be working with 81 and 100, except this time I'm going to go with the negative square root of 100 and the negative square root of 81. And the reason I'm doing this is because think of the number line, right? In the number line, if this is 0, all the numbers going this way are going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 numerically, right? So when you put a number here, that's going to be between 3 and 4, right? But if we go to the negatives, this is going to be -1, -2, -3, -4. If we put a number here, this is not between -3 and -4. This is between -4 and -3, because the smaller number actually looks bigger, but it's the smallest number. The smaller number is -4, bigger number is -3, right? So in this case, the square root, the negative square root of 100 is going to be a smaller number, right? So this is going to be -10. Because when you take the square root of a number, that's 10, right? Square root of 100 is 10, but then we have the negative outside, so we attach it here. So it's going to be -10. The square root of 81 is 9, but we have a negative here, so we attach it. So our number here, our negative square root of 95, is going to be a number somewhere between -10 and -9. If we follow our number line, right, we got -5, -6, -7, -8, -9, -10, right? Our number is going to be somewhere between here. So it's -10 and -9. So between -10 and -9, that's where our number is, closer to the negative square root of 100. So it's going to be closer to -10. So again, approximately -9.8. Okay, let's try another one with a negative outside, but this time you're going to try to do it. Okay, here we go. So let's say we have the square root of, or the negative square root of 72. Go ahead and press pause and try to do it on your own. Okay, so I'm going to think of two perfect squares that 72 is between. So 72 is between 64 and 81, right? 64 and 81, if they were positives, but because we have the negative right there, it's going to be negative square root of 81 and negative square root of 64. So the square root of 81 is 9, but the negative square root of 81 is -9. The negative square root of 64 is -8. So this number here has to be somewhere between, the negative square root of 72 has to be somewhere between -9 and -8, right? So it's going to be negative, let's see, 72 closer to 64 or closer to 81. Well, it's 9 numbers away from 81, and it is 8 numbers away from 64, so slightly closer to -8, right? So I would go, this is going to be approximately -8.4. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this video helped. I'll see you guys on the next video.